Hello, my name is Paula. In 2005, I lost my father to suicide. And back then, what really helped me was to try to understand, maybe this is just my way of dealing with pain, but I was in that fog that we go through when we lose someone to suicide, all those questions in my mind, and I really needed to understand what was happening and what had happened to my father. So since then, I have been working with suicide prevention. I have a website, and I'll have all the links below for you. I have a podcast where I interview people who have suicidal thoughts, families who lost loved ones, and also many specialists in the area. So I'll have all the links below if you're interested. But today, what we're going to talk about are books. Books help me immensely because, as I said before, we just want to understand. And I will start today with my favorite book of all. This was actually the first book that I read about suicide. Back then, I knew nothing. I had never been touched by suicide. I didn't know anyone who had died by suicide. So just the title itself to me sounded like the perfect book, The Suicidal Mind, because that's what I wanted to get into, to understand what made my father take that drastic measure and take his own life. So this is a book that I highly recommend, not only because it's a good book to help you understand what goes on in their minds, but also I have such great admiration for the author. His name is Edwin Shneidman, and I was lucky enough to interview him for my book, which I'll talk about later. It was just such an unbelievable, unforgettable interview for me because he is known in our area as the father of suicidology. He was the first person to open a suicide prevention center in California in the US. So it was my dream to talk to him when I was writing my book. And I actually did, and I was just so touched by him, by how humble he was. And I read all his books. By the time I interviewed him, I had read all his books, and this one was really precious to me because it was the first encounter into the suicidal mind. I'll just read two passages here that were significant to me at the time. The antidote to loneliness is friendship and affiliation. So the need to connect. We humans are wired to connect, and this is something that he really talks about. The other one is suffering is half pain and half being alone with that pain. So that's something that I just mentioned before, and it's just a very touching book. It has a lot of case stories, which always to me is the best. I like books that have a lot of data and research and information, but I think that we connect with people and stories, and this book has a lot of good stories. He was the first person to really get into this and study suicide. So I really highly recommend this book. Let me just see. I'm a content page kind of person. When I get a book, the first thing I do is go straight to the content page to see if I'm interested in what it covers. So it talks about why do we kill ourselves, the need to be loved, so the need for connection and personal relationships. Constriction, which is very important when it comes to the suicidal mind, because this is what happens, is that the person has this constricted view of life, and the only thing they see as a way out is dying. So anyway, there's so many reasons why I love this book. So here it is again. I'll have the cover here somewhere so you can write it down. So this is the first book that I wanted to talk about. Second book that I want to talk about is Night Falls Fast by Redfield Jamison. This is another great book that I keep with. I'm not the kind of person who keeps books very much, but there are some that they're just close to my heart, and this is one of them. She wrote, it's actually a mix of memoir because she did attempt suicide at the age of 28. This is a highly specialized, I mean, she does a lot of research in the area of mental illness. She understands what she's talking about. She is bipolar herself, and that's the disease that actually took her to the edge. So she talks about her personal experience with suicide, but not only that, but she has a lot of research here. She talks about neurobiology, what really happens in your brain when you're in that constricted mind, and it has a lot of cases too. She interviewed a lot of people who lost loved ones to suicide, and also people who attempted suicide. So it's a great book because it's not just about what happened to her, but also other people, and it has a lot of specialists too talking about it. She has another book called An Unquiet Mind, and I read that one too, and it's about her experience and what led her to suicide attempt. In her experience with the disease, the bipolar that goes, the ups and downs, the mania, and then the deep depression that she would get into. So it's a very good book to understand from the point of view of the person who attempts suicide. So I highly recommend this book. Here it is. I will have maybe the page somewhere else too. So this is the second book. The third book that I'm going to talk about, I did struggle with this, I have to say, be honest. I wasn't sure whether or not I should talk about my own book, but here it is. I understand that, why not? It took me years to finish this book. It was a finalist in the Brazilian Book Award, so it's quite recognized as a good book. So it also, in a way, it's kind of like Jamison's book, because I talk about my own experience with suicide, my dad's death, and I talk about a little bit of how I see it in perspective now and in retrospect. But I also interviewed a lot of specialists to try to understand and make it easy to read. As a journalist, I worked as a journalist most of my life, so I was very focused on making this book an easy read for the general public. So I talk about warning signs, I talk about risk factors, I have loads of cases and interviews with families who lost loved ones to suicide. So I think it's it gives you a good overall view, but I talk about data too and numbers and how to look at numbers, because we have to be careful about that. So here it is, that's my own book. I am quite proud of it. It was such a hard book to write. I have no idea. I had to actually stop twice because I was just getting too deep, and in a way I was reliving the death of my father. So between the beginning of my research and the end when I published, I was diagnosed with depression myself. I treated my depression. Fortunately, it was one of those cases that I didn't have to take medication for very long. I only did it for 1 year, and since then it's been more than 10 years now, and I'm doing fine. So it was an episode due to my father's suicide, and I think I just dig into deep. So I'm very proud of it. It was a hard book to read, but I know that it helps people because I hear from my readers all the time. The fourth book is After Suicide, A Ray of Hope for Those Left Behind. So the author is Eleanora Betsy Ross, and one of the reasons why I really enjoyed this book is that she zooms into grief and what are the differences between what she calls natural death or normal death and suicide. She lost her husband, so she also speaks from a place of experience. It's kind of a memoir too, but she does zoom into the emotions as well. And one of the things I'll just highlight for you, and I'm sure many of you will relate to this as I did in my own case of suicide loss, is that she says that in natural loss, privacy is respected when someone dies, and with suicide, it's the opposite. People start thinking about who is the person who is responsible for this, why did he or she do it, who is at fault. There is so much guilt and shame. And also the other difference that she highlights is that in natural death, words of comfort is what we get, the family members, and with suicide it's silence, partly because it's such a stigma and a taboo in our society to talk about suicide. So she just goes into very deep in all these things, and she has a lot of cases too. She has stories because she also interviewed a lot of people. And it's just a good book to understand grief and the differences between what we call normal grief or suicide grief. So I highly recommend this book. The fifth and last book that I want to recommend today is called Silent Grief, Living in the Wake of Suicide, written by Christopher Lukas and Henry Seiden. And the reason why I recommend this is because it's also a half memoir, but it's most of it is about his own history with suicide, which is heartbreaking because at the age of 6, his mom took her own life, but he didn't know that until he turned 17. So that's how bad the stigma is, and really how it just shows how difficult it is for parents, understandably, to know when to tell their kids. So this is one of the things that he really zooms into the book. And he talks about how to approach kids, how to talk to them about suicide. Also, after that, his uncle also took his own life. And then a few years later, his best friend. And that was kind of the tipping point for Lukas. He said, okay, we need to talk about this. His friend was 50 years old when he took his life, and that's when Lukas decided, okay, enough of silence, I've had enough of this, I'm going to write a book. And he couldn't find many books that help him with his own grief and to understand what suicide is, and also help open this dialogue about suicide. So that's one of the things that I really enjoy about this book, and I recommend it because he knows it from his own perspective, but he also does some research. But it's a lovely book to read. So I think this is it for today. I will be doing more of these book reviews, not only about suicide, but many themes that are related to suicide, even books about grief that are not specifically about suicide, because I do believe that it is important to read these books, and they help me a lot. So I just hope that with these recommendations, I help you deal with your grief as well. Thank you.